Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Right Ruminations on our last episode of his series on the Parthenon, the Paleo-Conservatives. Now, the Paleo-Conservatives have been brought up a lot as a general overall discussion because in a lot of ways they are a kind of segue between the old right during, say, the New Deal and the Fair Deal era and what we have today with the alt-right and paleo-libertarianism and neo-reaction and all of these groups. And we mentioned two of the big names, Sam Francis and Patrick J. Buchanan of the paleo-conservative movement. And in fact, it's interesting how paleo has shifted. Initially, of course, social conservatism was a big part of it. So when Pat Buchanan ran for president in 92, 96, and 2000, he campaigned on the culture war. But with Trump's election in 2016, which has largely abandoned the culture war, he talks about Donald Trump is the platform of paleo-conservatism. And by that, I assume he means economic nationalism, populism, and an implicit ethno-nationalism because of the fear of immigration. So why don't we begin with a sort of sketch on your perspective on the history of the paleo-conservative movement?
Well, the paleoconservative movement has roots in what is called the old right. That is people we've discussed before in relation to, say, the paleo-libertarians. It was generally a coalition of Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans who were, say, sometimes opposed to the New Deal, sometimes opposed to the war in, that is World War II. But I think that where the real antecedents to paleoconservatism lie, or the real antecedent lies, is with the something called the new conservatives, ironically enough. Associated with people like Russell Kirk and Richard M. Weaver, and maybe even to an extent someone like Mel Bradford. But I think that these were more kind of gentlemanly scholar types, sort of 1950s conservatives. And this is something that sort of formed the bedrock of traditionalist conservatism in the American sense, most closely associated with Russell Kirk and the early William F. Buckley. Now, this became watered down fairly early on with something called fusionism, which basically took this idea of traditionalist Burkean conservatism and intermingled it with a kind of libertarianism. But even then, that fusionism became kind of more mainstream with introductions of people like the neoconservatives. And very quickly, I think this kind of Kirkian legacy devolved or sort of dissolved into the broader conservative movement, which then became called the New Right. It's funny how often this term New Right is applied again and again for completely different things throughout history. But the paleo movement as such, I think, was an attempt to get back to that old right, to the pre-World War II right, or even the just after World War II right, like people like Robert Taft, Russell Kirk, H.L. Mencken, and to react against the ascendance of the neoconservatives. So I think what really brought this about was the end of the Cold War. There was the thinking, well, the United States is no longer involved in the fighting the Cold War. The Soviet Union has capitulated, and there's no reason for America to. The American empire no longer has an excuse to embrace big government. That is the Buckleyite excuse of, well, I favor big government because we're now at war, is no longer applicable. And so, seeing that the neoconservatives wanted to continue this kind of this American imperial project into Pax Americana with the welfare warfare state, paleoconservatism was basically saying, now we have to go back to being a normal country again. We have to go back to being a nation state. So it's time to we have to close the borders or limit immigration. we have to stop all of these imperial adventures. We have to stop this kind of rhetoric of American exceptionalism and of multiculturalism, political correctness. And it was basically the idea of kind of de-ideologizing American conservatism so it could be brought back down to earth, I think. And in terms of practical policies, I would say two things. One is that it consists of all those things I said, right? It's small r Republican, it's anti-imperialist, anti-cultural Marxist, anti-globalism, anti-mass migration, kind of sort of proto-alt-right in a sense. But the second thing I'd say is that the thing that distinguishes it from the new conservatives or the Burkeans or the Kirkians, that the kind of old school traditionalists, is that unlike them, the paleoconservatives were not as openly anti-ideological. They were more militant, more confrontational, more cantankerous, and less into this kind of, wistful, almost Chestertonian kind of nostalgia you get with the Kirk type conservatives. So that's my introduction to the topic.
Now, some of the issues that sort of became associated with the paleoconservative movement would have been isolationism or non-interventionism, economic nationalism, populism, social conservatism, and in a sort of germinal form of San Francis ethno-nationalism. And my beginnings in all this, politically speaking, would have been paleoconservatism and paleo-libertarianism, that sort of fruitful exchange in the early 2000s. And really, it goes back to the 1980s with the Triple R. And so one of the things is the general, and this is what led to the alliance between libertarians and paleoconservatives, is non-interventionism. And a lot of the arguments, there's sort of the economic arguments that empires are expensive, that the libertarians make. A further development of that argument is that pacification techniques developed in other countries are then brought home and militarized by the police. So the Philippine insurrection in the early 20th century, the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s, these techniques of pacification were then brought home. And of course, these conscripted soldiers then had to find jobs, and many of them, became police and consultants to the police. And so that led to a diminution of our liberty at home. And then there's the cost of empire. Does the cost outweigh the benefit? To whose benefit are we fighting? Given how ungrateful France and much of Europe is for America's sacrifices in World War II, and as I would argue, African Americans are for Union sacrifices in the Civil War, what were the sacrifices made for? To whose benefit? It certainly doesn't seem to be to our benefit, the people who had to make the sacrifice. And then the sort of more cultural, philosophical arguments, usually rooted in the teachings of the Founding Fathers. And I think that we have, with that famous statement by John Quincy Adams, America does not go abroad looking for monsters to destroy. And in that speech he gives, he mentions that America might very well become mistress of the world. But if she did, America would no longer be a land of free men, but a land of subjects. And that's what the paleoconservatives were afraid of, I think rightfully so, as we've seen the rise of the state and its interventionist policies. And something that neither the paleoconservatives nor the libertarians really were thinking about, but the corporate subversion, where it's right now, it's not so much the state that's suppressing our free speech, but corporations like Google and Facebook and Twitter. And so, but again, it's part of this global imperial order. I mean, in a lot of ways, I would agree with Keith Preston that this public-private distinction only goes so far, that when it comes to the U.S. empire, they're really parts of a holistic organism that's not reducible to any one piece. And I really think the non-interventionist policy criticism was one of the strongest that the paleoconservatives brought to the table.
Well, it is, and I think that a lot of it is instinctive, because they can sense that there is a kind of cultural pressure on the part of the elites to want people to get to conform to the you might say, the ideology of the American empire, right? Like, so even for Democrats who, at least in the past, were ostensibly anti-war, there is this kind of sense in which when one is initially declared, they will have some kind of enthusiasm for it, right? Like, you're not going to find, yes, you did find a lot of that against George W. Bush later on, but there was this kind of sense of, when the Iraq War did break out, there were a lot of Democrats and, the New York Times and all of these things that supported it, right? When people like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, opposes basically the United States, I don't know, siding with ISIS or something, in favor of Assad, then they kind of become, very suspicious of anyone who's on side with her on that. And so there is this sense that although they may sometimes play lip service or pay lip service to anti-war preferences, that the whole of the establishment, left and right, are all kind of intertwined in this investment in war. So I don't even know if it's that being opposed to war is necessarily essentially integral to the paleoconservative outlook, so much as that they can tell who is in charge right now. And they can tell that those people are invested in all of these wars. So there's probably something not entirely wholesome about them. Now, to the question of whether or not this kind of trad or traditionalist worldview is inherently anti-war, or to the extent that it is anti-war in the way that they present it as being, I think it depends on what antecedent you look back to, right? If you're looking back to the South and to like the antebellum South, then absolutely the American Republic, in many of the sort of states' rights populist elements that they supported, it was not anti-war at all. There's this kind of retro-gate or this kind of retconning of U.S. history to make it look more paleocon than it was, when much of Southern history was simultaneously bellicose and classically liberal, so not exactly Buchananites. Whereas by contrast, if you do look, if you kind of take the route that Russell Kirk did, and you look to say, John Quincy Adams or John Adams at least, or the Federalists, then there does seem to be this kind of almost kind of old Whig, like Ed Burkean opposition to war. So the extent to which the paleocon's opposition to imperialism does or does not correspond to conservative antecedents is tenuous at best.
Yeah, the quote from John Adams that really highlights this concern is, he says, "She well knows that by once established enlisting under the banners than her own, when they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication." In light of the Iraq War, that's quite prescient. In all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom, the maxims of her policy would increasingly change from liberty to force. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. And that's exactly what we've seen all across the board. And I think, again, this is why the paleoconservative position on foreign policy is probably one of their strongest points. And it's also bipartisan, because we have many examples throughout the history of the United States of people on the political right and the political left, even as far as socialists like Eugene Debs, opposing U.S. intervention into foreign countries. And to the extent that they either have tried and failed or have not tried at all to reach out to the left on this issue, it would be interesting to explore.
Well, I mean, I tend to agree with Paul Gottfried on this, that actually attempts to reach out to the left on the foreign policy issue can often seem rather juvenile, because, first of all, the left is not nearly as anti-war or uniformly anti-war as it presents itself as being. Even someone like Noam Chomsky, and this has to be the kind of pinnacle of or epitome of Trump derangement syndrome, is when Noam Chomsky came out and said that indeed it would be a good idea for the United States to maintain a military presence in Syria. Now, this is something that I think, with respect to the left, is a point of unreliability. And this is something Paul Gottfried pointed out in an article in the American Conservative, that really the left is not interested in cooperating with the right on the anti-war issue, unless they're like Keith Preston or something like that, somebody like that. Generally speaking, the left's opposition to war is a kind of consequence of their opposition to colonialism and Western civilization. So there have been people like the American Conservative or LouRockwell.com, and occasionally you'll get a libertarian who will come out and talk about how much deep respect they have for Noam Chomsky or for who was Howard Zinn or somebody like that. And meanwhile, they're not sure about Trump because populism is anti-conservative, and you get these kind of articles from people like Rod Dreher and the kind of crunchy con, quasi-paleo-conservative people. And I think that insofar as they do try to reach out to the left, it's always the worst element of the right doing that. And it never really works because the left doesn't care. So I'm not really enthusiastic about that particular line that the right might take.
Mm-hmm. The other argument that Pale-Conservatives make that is also one of their stronger arguments is economic nationalism. So this of course develops in the 80s and 90s as a response to globalism, which occurred under the last term of Ronald Reagan, and then the first term of George Herbert Walker Bush, and then the two Clinton terms. And the argument that was sold us, well, we'll get cheaper goods because they're going to be made in other parts of the world, and we'll have low import tariffs so we can get them all in real cheap. Of course, the problem is if you hollow out American jobs, well, then you have unemployment, and you really can't compete against China because China pollutes its environment and doesn't have worker rights. So they can have much lower costs of production because they're willing to destroy their environment and screw their people over. And American firms and workers who want to play by these rules get discriminated against because, and no one's going to pressure China to not do that. I mean, for all this talk about Copenhagen, was it 10 years ago? Nobody was putting pressure on China to stop pollution. It was always the United States or France or England that had to stop polluting, not China, not India. And they saw that what ended up happening was, and it has happened. You have the hollowing out of the Rust Belt. U.S. unemployment reached record highs not seen since the Great Depression. So from 2007 to 2009, you had large amounts of unemployment. And, this sort of wave is what Trump has been riding into the White House.
Well, the question of tariffs and protectionism is another point of curiosity when it comes to the paleoconservatives, because of course the really hardline paleoconservatives are almost uniformly fans of the Old South, and of course the history of American sectarianism has been the kind of protectionist North against the free trading South. And in fact, one of Calhoun's greatest legacies was in the nullification or attempt at nullification of what was called the Tariff of Abomination, passed under Andrew Jackson. And so one thing that has always kind of interested me is that you have these kind of bearded paleocons who are at things like the League of the South, and are basically in the terms of the internet today, LARPing as kind of Confederate antebellum type grandfatherly figures, but at the same time they're almost uniformly protectionist. Now, to my understanding, the whole destruction of the Southern economic system, the whole agrarian system, and then later the something similar things happened in the West, which is one of the reasons William Jennings Bryan was kind of a proto-Buchananite in other ways, was an avid free trader, is because free trade was associated with the farmers, with agrarianism, and of course it was the industrial northern nation-state system that was built up under the system of Henry Clay, the America system. And so it's kind of interesting that none of them really bothered to point this out, with a few exceptions. The really hard-line Southerners like Clyde Wilson or Donald Livingston supported, basically like the Abbeville Institute people would support free trade, because they were so into the Southern identity thing that they even wanted to have the same trade policies as John C. Calhoun. But I think that there is this kind of irony that basically the logic goes something like this: that the industrial order under Lincoln, Henry Clay, the Northerners, first the Federalists, then later on the Whigs, then the Republicans, this new order was propped up by tariffs and the central bank. So we need to keep those, to keep that system, even though the whole history of what we support is against people who created that system. So there's this kind of irony. Let me put it this way: from any other point in history, I think it would have looked, regardless of what one thinks about tariffs, it would have looked a little bizarre to tell anyone in the past that we're going to have a populist movement that favors protectionism. Right? Of course, protectionism being the system that, builds up industry and consolidates things in cities. That's not to say anything about what my position is on protectionism. What I would say is that the paleo-libertarians can take up this line, right? They do kind of hammer home the point, like someone like Thomas D. Lorenzo, right? That, Lincoln was a big protectionist and all of that kind of thing. What I would say is that I think on the tariff issue, there are two problems, right? One is, I think that the paleo-conservatives never really properly address the libertarians' arguments, right? It's all based on empirical evidence, and I believe in empirical evidence, and I'm not, committing 100% to the Austrian position. But what I do think is that the paleo-conservatives have never really properly said, tariffs were destructive then. Why are they not going to be destructive now, right? They haven't answered that question. How do you know that tariffs won't be used by the U.S. government, like in a way that will favor them, but that will favor the state? How are tariffs compatible with keeping up with the technology of other countries? And to what extent can degradations in the system be basically, this is what I would put. If I were to play devil's advocate against a Buchananite, I would say this: according to your own kind of, neo-Confederate history or whatever, all those Rust Belt jobs that you like so much were there artificially anyway, because the United States shored them up through tariffs, kind of in the Henry Clay Lincoln Project. Why do you think that they have long-term viability? And on the other hand, the thing that the libertarians never really properly answer with respect to the paleocons is that the libertarians are dealing with a world, are dealing in the abstract. The Austrians are dealing in the abstract with what will make the whole situation better, right? What will make the whole sphere of economic activity that you're discussing better? But, somebody might justly say, well, I don't care about the world economy, right? So yes, if you give special favoritism to an individual corporation, that's bad for the country. So I'm against that. But you might say, by the same token, well, if I give money to if a special favor like a tariff is kind of enforced for my country, then I don't care if that makes the rest of the world worse, because I don't care about spheres that go beyond that. But I will say that there is this curiosity. I'm not sure how the paleo-conservative hardliners really properly answer the objection of why is it that you're so eager to and have so much faith in these jobs that were shored up by the same project of Northern consolidation that you view to be the worst evil in American history?
Well, another contradiction is the paleo-libertarians and libertarians who talk about why is libertarian theory superior? Because it leads to more economic development. And they claim that all the suite of ideas that are in their philosophy lead to greater economic development. But looking at the United States, looking at Germany, looking at France, large-scale industrial economic development was not under a free trade regime. It was under a regime of protectionism and strong government intervention. So that doesn't really work out. Free trade societies tended to be agrarian, like the South. Obviously, the United Kingdom is a major exception. But generally speaking, the other free trade societies were agrarian and lost to the more protectionist ones. So there is this odd history getting in the way for these people. And of course, this is the issue that broke the paleo-libertarian, paleo-conservative alliance. I mean, I remember reading some articles from Lou Aqua where he basically said, look, Pat Buchanan is great on foreign policy, but he's an economic illiterate, and you know we can't deal with economic illiterates, so we're just going to cut Pat Buchanan out. I mean, that's more or less what he said.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if maybe the paleo-libertarians and paleo-conservatives should switch places so that the paleo-libertarians can have a protectionist, highly industrialized cosmopolitan society, and the paleo-conservatives can use free trade to get back to an agrarian society.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, the other aspect, this is kind of multifaceted because nationalism, populism, and ethno-nationalism all kind of it's like looking at the same thing from different perspectives. At least with you look at a diamond and it reflects light in different ways depending on where you look at it. And nationalism is, of course, for someone like Pat Buchanan, the sort of the nation state of the United States. So in a republic, not an empire, he's generally favorable of Abraham Lincoln. He's not necessarily anti-South, but he does believe in the primacy of the Union and does speak favorably of Abraham Lincoln, especially with his regard of one war at a time with Seward. They wanted to fight England over the Trent affair. But as you said, there's a lot of, neo-Confederate types who are paleo-conservatives as well. And of course, they're not going to like Lincoln all that much. Now, Pat Buchanan didn't openly discuss ethno-nationalism, not in the way that the alt-right does or the way Sam Francis did. The way he dog-whistled about ethno-nationalism was diversity. He said the diverse countries are not the ethnically diverse countries are unstable countries. And he would point to like Yugoslavia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the states created in Africa left in the wake of decolonization, the states created in the Middle East in the wake of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And these ethnically diverse states are unstable and violent. That was about as far as Pat Buchanan went. He did also talk about demographic decline of white people, which is true as well. So in many ways, it's kind of incredible what he did get away with before he finally had to withdraw from public life after Churchill, Hitler, and the unnecessary war. But that aspect, they're all kind of related because the populist element of nationalism is that it opposes globalism. It opposes what they perceive as the stripping away of U.S. sovereignty and U.S. identity. And of course, no matter how you want to couch it, the United States is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's what the United States was, and if it's anything, still is. You could argue we're in a period of transition towards something else. And so those three elements, which are not always explicitly delineated, are sort of interlocking perspectives of the alt-right on nationhood, race, and nationality.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the difference between Buchanan's position and Sam Francis's race. Now, there is, of course, a difference between them and the current ethno-nationalists in that even Sam Francis said that he was not favorable towards the idea of deporting citizens, right? That he was okay with obviously deporting migrants, or at least illegal migrants. But somebody asked him a question about this in a speech, and he said, "Well, I don't know how you'd bring that about, without there being some kind of mass bloodshed or something like that, a new trail of tears, as it were." And I think that with Sam Francis, it's more the emphasis on it that's explicit, whereas with Buchanan, it's not as explicit, or the emphasis isn't as obvious. But I think if you read his book, Will America Survive the 21st Century, or something like that? I forget exactly what it's called. It's one of his it's not one of his earliest books. I think it was written in 2012 or something like that. And he has a chapter about the death of white America. And that's something that even Rod Dreher, when he heard it, didn't really seem that angry about it. And it was kind of strange that, Rod Dreher is this kind of bleeding heart, crunchy con, however you describe Rod Dreher, who, can't stand Trump because he said something bad or whatever. But, he has this kind of reverence for Pat Buchanan. And, I can't help but, on a certain level, identify with Pat Buchanan, in that for some reason I've had the experience as well that he seems to, and this seems like a strange thing to say about Buchanan, but he gets away with things. That is, he says things in such a way that would get other people in a lot of trouble. And for some reason, even though, of course, the mainstream media, they show themselves as hating him, but we know what it really looks like when they hate someone, and it doesn't look like the way they treat him. And so there's this sense in which he does seem to, be non-confrontational enough, I think, to get away with certain things that maybe Francis was not so much up to that task.
Well, I think it also helps that in many ways Pat Buchanan was a political insider. He worked for Nixon. I think he worked for Herbert Walker Bush. But regardless, he is able to get away with a lot. The other aspect of paleoconservatism, and this is what drew me to it back in the early 2000s, was the social conservative element that Pat Buchanan ran on during the 90s. He had the culture war speech. And, really beginning with the Bushes, they sort of gave up on the idea of waging the culture war, as, earlier right-wing conservative generations would have. And Pat Buchanan sort of pointed out that, yeah, that was a mistake on the part of the sort of neoconservative right, where they just kind of gave up on these cultural issues. And it's not entirely clear, at least from when I used to look into Sam Francis, and certainly not the alt-right today. The alt-right today doesn't really accept a lot of the norms of social conservatism, like, for instance, they're pro-abortion, because in their mind that eliminates undesirables, both of people of color and of low IQ or physically weak white people. They tend to not be as concerned about monogamy and Christianity and Christendom as the paleoconservatives were. And this may not be fair to say, but I sort of get the impression this attitude begins with Sam Francis. He just wasn't that interested in those things. Not so much that he was opposed to them, but that wasn't his emphasis. And his followers, if you will, his ideological followers, have taken that to the next degree, where they're just like, well, not only are these issues not important, they're getting in the way of the real goal, saving the white race. And that really sort of is the sort of elephant in the room, right? What sort of propelled Pat Buchanan to national dominance in the 90s was the religious right, which was the development in the 70s and 80s by Paul Weyrich and Bill Lind and others to create this sort of ecumenical conservative, not just Christian, but religious. Before 9/11, there were Muslims who were also collaborating in domestic politics. So, for example, I forget that bill in California that was against gay marriage. It had Jews and Muslims and Mormons. So it was really just a conservative religious alliance that's more or less completely disappeared, at least in the public eye. You don't hear conservative pundits talk about it. Maybe they assume they can get the vote and they don't bother because they assume they can get those people, and they're trying to get new people who a socially conservative narrative might turn off. So they just quietly, put it away, don't talk about it. But I think that's one of the strongest elements of paleoconservatism that's been left. Social science data has proven time and time again that the single most important factor in having a well-adjusted adult is being raised by two parents that live together in a stable household relationship, a mother and a father. And, that's the most important. And that's when you can't choose. the guy who wrote Bowling Alone, Putnam, he was interviewed by Bill Kristol, and he said, yeah, I mean, nobody in sociology doubts the primary importance of a stable family environment, which was front and center for Pat Buchanan. You know, family values, families sticking together. I know we also see with Pew studies and Gallup studies that people are healthier and happier who are religious. If you look at it's general in the sense that whether you're a Jew, a Mormon, a Muslim, a Christian, a Protestant, a Catholic, whatever, you're better off than an atheist or a liberal or someone who's very hedonistic and doesn't really have this sort of strong in-group preferences towards, your co-religionists. So all these things are just beyond doubt now with sociological data backing us up. And right when the social sciences, which is dominated by left-wing intellectuals, finally accepts our basic premise, we give up the rhetorical debate. It's kind of madness.
Well, I might be a little more in sympathy with the Sam Francis or alt-right perspective than you are with respect to this, simply because you have to remember that the religious right ultimately did go with the Republican establishment and not with Pat Buchanan, whereas Trump, running on many of the same policies, though not on the culture war one so much, did actually end up being elected. So I think that it can be exaggerated, the extent to which that is the desirable or most convincing line to pursue. Secondly, I would say that there is an issue with the thing that you brought up with the alt-right. Favoring abortion or being okay with, not necessarily being as strict on monogamy and these things. It really depends on who in the alt-right you're talking about, right? Either they are more liberal than the paleo-conservatives on those things, or more, flexible. Yes, I remember that Richard Spencer, he said something like, this culture war is really just a way to divide white people. And so I do know the phenomenon you're talking about. But at the same time, when the alt-right are conservative on culture war issues, they go off the deep end. It's like, they really want the whole thing, right? They want women to lose the franchise. They want, I'm not saying whether I disagree or agree with any, that's not the point. But, they are not, like the majority, I think, of people on the alt-right are anti-abortion. They are generally in favor, like if you listen to somebody like Millennial Woes and you hear all of his guests, right, they're generally in favor of monogamy. I'm on a lot of sort of dissident right streams, and you get the sense that on a lot of these issues, you might say on the social issues, right, that they are far right often on the social issues, but when it comes to the cultural element, in a certain sense of that word, when it comes to the things that Sam Francis thought were very sentimental, like wanting to censor dirty movies or wanting to, keep bad language out of TV, or these things that seem kind of trivial or maybe vulgar, or this kind of neo-Victorian rhetoric. And I think that's more of what Francis was against. I think that's more of what the alt-right is against. So I don't necessarily think that these people are as anti-traditionalist as they might seem in some respects. And so I can have an appreciation for trying to exercise the right of some of the, maybe more culturally conformist or neo-Victorian elements in the culture war as it existed under Buchanan.
You got to remember, I think it was... I forget which group it was now, but Richard Spencer had that lecture in defense of degeneracy. Do you remember that?
Well, I do, and I think that it's nuanced, right? I mean, Richard Spencer, what he wants is neither degeneracy in the liberal sense, nor is it traditionalism in the Buchananite sense, right? What he wants is like what he sees as old world traditionalism plus degeneracy, right? Like you've got your old world society and you have the alpha male with his harem, and then you have the rest of the people who are pretty monogamous, and then you maybe have some prostitutes, but people don't really like them. And so like the whole picture, right, of like what an old world society. So it's very quixotic, right? It's a kind of like, I think that it is a certain way that Richard Spencer has a certain childlikeness about the way he looks at things, where he's like, well, what would a society that Indiana Jones would stumble on look like? Well, it would have all these different anthropological elements, right? I really do think that's a part of it, right? Like the kind of romanticizing societies of the past anthropology. But what he doesn't realize is that those societies weren't sitting around thinking, look at how cool we are. We're traditional historical societies who are doing all of these interesting things. I think they just kind of, that's just the situation they were in. But I think that with a lot of people on the alt-right, right, there is a focus on, you know, on degeneracy, making it so that women are, you know, more hypergamous. Like they'll take that from like the Manospherian language. How there are problems with people, you know, being purposeless, and how there needs to be more like loyalty. And so there is this strong trad element to the alt-right. Whereas I think with Francis, I mean, you're right, the emphasis was taken away from it. I'm just not sure to what extent the removal of that element of, you know, focus on values, as it were, has really hindered the right. It seems to correlate fairly well with its success, because you have to remember that the culture war and Buchanan were not successful.
No, in purely practical terms, you're probably right. That the more economic and ethnic concerns were more resonant than the cultural concerns. But I guess what I was pointing out, though, is in the 90s, the social science establishment was roundly basically condemning Christians as a sort of arm of, you know, militant secularism. But now they've pretty much admitted we were right on everything. And I feel like, you know, at this point, giving that up might be a mistake, because now we have a much better opportunity to make the point logically and to prove it to other people. It's like, oh, read the social science journal. They'll back us up. Because, you know, in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s, it just, you couldn't do that. That was really what I was getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think nobody is, to be honest, that particular model of traditionalism is almost more compatible with the sort of Sam Francis model, because, you know, it's what you're talking about is sociology and kind of the foundations of a stable society. I really don't think that there are a lot of worthwhile people on the right, you know, post Francis, who would really object to that. I think it's more the emphasis has moved away from a kind of maybe like campiness that they associate with the religious right, and also something you have to remember, right? It's not just that the economic and ethnic issues were more appealing to some people. It's that the Christian right may have found those issues appealing, but the Christian right ended up going with the establishment Republicans. So I think we have to remember that too.
Yeah, there is that too. And so that's one of the interesting aspects. They're not really represented on the dissident right because they haven't yet been burned badly enough by the establishment to reconsider all their options. And while, you know, it is somewhat fashionable to be a sort of like hipster trad cat, most Catholics are still supportive of the two parties, one form or another. They haven't been burned badly enough either to en masse seriously reconsider that position. And I suppose in some sense that's both a good and a bad thing. It's bad in the sense that they're locked into the same problem, that perpetuating the same problem that we have, but it's also better in that at least if delay can be fatal, initiating a fight you're not prepared for can be even more fatal. And a lot of this sort of trigger happiness I see on the far right and the far left, you know, if let loose could lead to a lot of dangerous blowback.
Yeah, I have to wonder, in like the kind of world that somebody like Mark Citadel wants, what TV would look like. Like first you have like some kind of action James Bond movie, and then during the commercials you have like a advertisement for Eastern Orthodox chalices or something, and it's like the whole together with like the liturgical fixtures, and it can be, you know, both have both bravado and liturgical piety, and just like the whole picture. Like I do kind of like on the one hand, the kind of the trad Eastern Orthodox thing that you're talking about. Not to go on a digression here, but it kind of reminds me of, I have a difficult time picturing what the culture would look like. It would be like I said, golden crosses plus cell phone cases.
Well, yeah, that is part of the problem. Imagining what that kind of a future would look like. I mean, obviously, this is a nice segue to Mr. Paleoconservative himself, William S. Lind, who's famous for his theories on fourth generation warfare, which, not being the subject of tonight's discussion, though he did write a book called Victoria, where he does deal with fourth generation warfare and the collapse of the United States. But this kind of, are you familiar with his idea of retroculture?
I don't think so.
It's sort of like, what does a paleo culture look like? And basically, for like, the military and first responders and the government, certain advanced technologies are still used, but people just give up things like TV and go back to radio, and they just sort of try to use styles and technologies from an earlier period in history. He doesn't really quite flesh that out, because that really occurs at the end of the book. So it's more of a tease, but it's sort of like the 1940s with levels of technology and culture, except in the government. That's sort of what it looks like for him.
Yeah, I mean, I do roughly know who he is, and this is one of the problems with paleoconservatism, right? Which is I jest at the kind of the Mark Citadel cultural vision, which I just made up now and projected onto him, and it's absolutely nothing to do with anything Mark Citadel has ever said. But the idea, though, that joking aside, right, that image of golden crosses plus cell phone cases is probably actually more realizable than what many of the paleoconservatives want to return to. Because when you hear people like Pat Buchanan and not the more sophisticated ones like Paul Gottfried, but when you hear like Buchananites like Paul Craig Roberts or like Tom Fleming, you kind of have a sense that they really do want antithesis without any synthesis, right? They really do want to go back. Like they think that if they try hard enough, then one day a Republican might get elected who will take people back to 1964. And it's like, it's actually more, in a sense, it's actually, I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but it's actually more, it's easier to envision a society where America actually did become Eastern Orthodox than to imagine a Republican getting elected and taking it back to 1964. So in that sense, I mean, you can laugh at it, but in a sense, somebody like Mark Citadel or reactionary Ian do have like a kind of understanding of something about reality that maybe some of like the older generation of paleoconservatives didn't, and that they didn't like really get the way politics doesn't and can never work.
Well, what would you say would be, if paleoconservatism wants to become relevant again or maintain relevance, what advice would you give?
Well, I would say that it should probably do as Paul Gottfried does, right? Cooperate with libertarians, show support for populists. You probably don't want to go down the route that Tom Fleming went down, where he couldn't even get along with people at Chronicles magazine, and now I believe is still the head of the Fleming Foundation. So what I would say is that it has tended to be the cantankerousness and abrasiveness of the paleoconservatives, and I suppose an ironic kind of ideological purity. That is, they're often so opposed to ideology that they refuse to cooperate with the ideological. And while I don't claim to know what happened between Hans Hermann Hoppe and Tom Fleming and at the very end of the Paleo Alliance, I have a very strong feeling that it had a lot to do with the kind of exclusivist tone that you see in the pages of Chronicles magazine, right? Where everyone who isn't a protectionist is an idiot. You know, anyone who basically isn't a paleoconservative is delusional. And they probably want to put that aside in favor of something more analytical. And that Paul Gottfried has at least implied that he's trying to revive some kind of cooperation between people in his own circle and the paleo-libertarians at the Mises Institute. So I'm hopeful that it'll take its cues from people like Buchanan and Gottfried, and not from the kind of Tory escapists. I think that the idea of adjuncting itself to both libertarianism and populism is probably a good bet. And I want to make just a quick clarification before we end. When I was talking about the reactionaries having some sense of knowing like the way history develops, whereas the paleocons in a weird kind of way are less realistic. I was not at all meaning to, validate maybe certain kind of grandiose thinking on the part of the reactionaries, but just to say that the paleoconservatives fail to fully like internalize that history always has a directedness, right? That it's never going to be the way they remembered it to be. And I do think that the more dramatic elements of the dissident right are at least right in pointing out that particular blind spot that they seem to have.
So I guess, is there anything else you want to add to our discussion on the paleoconservatives?
Not particularly, other than that I think that its legacy long-term seems to have been in the alt-right and the populists through intermediaries like Gavin McInnes and Tacky Mag and Jim Goad and people who were kind of, late generation paleo-conservative. So its legacy sort of lives on in certain aspects of the dissident right that are not really part of paleo-conservatism institutionally. And beyond that, I think that the irony, and this will be really my final word with paleoconservatism, is that it really is the architect of the new right in many ways, right? It was Paul Gottfried who called for an alternative right and who was Richard Spencer's mentor in a way at the H.L. Mencken Club before Richard Spencer really fully developed in his thought. And really the whole even Hans Hermann Hoppe has described the alt-right as basically the successor to the paleoconservative movement. So there is a kind of irony in the fact that out of all these groups, they're the least heard of, they're the least well-known, they're the most hidden, even though they're kind of the focal point of all of this. And so there's that irony in that. But I think that the whole right really owes a great debt to the paleoconservatives. Finally, I'd like to thank you for interviewing me for the whole of this series, including tonight's interview. And just to remind people that you can find me on Right Ruminations on YouTube. So thanks again, and I think this was a nice series.
Yes, thank you, Right Ruminations, for bringing the idea up. It was a very interesting journey over these almost 2 months now, I think. So this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.